Acting President Delcy Rodríguez walks a diplomatic tightrope as she concludes her 5-day India visit. She has to balance Russia, USA, China and India all at once as a new paradigm regime change in Venezuela after the dramatic Operation Absolute Resolve to capture the Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. In a highly strategic geopolitical maneuver, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio on 21st May announced her upcoming travel to India. Rubio's disclosure attracted attention because such visits are typically announced by the countries involved rather than third parties. Breaking the diplomatic norm, Rubio explicitly demonstrated that Venezuelan crude is heavily linked to America's economic strategy. The US heavily backing Delcy Rodríguez's interim government and helped restructure Venezuelan oil sales apparatus. He treated US historic energy export and Venezuelan oil as a part of a single unified American package to New Delhi, essentially signaling the world that Washington now holds the key to Venezuela's energy tap. In global power game for acting President Delcy Rodríguez, balancing USA, Russia and China is nothing less than walking a tight diplomatic rope, as China is Venezuela's banker and economic lifeline. Russia is Venezuela's security and military lifeline. The United States is becoming Venezuela's gateway back into global energy market.
And the relationship with Venezuela is incredible. We've taken out millions and millions of barrels of oil out of Venezuela. It's very oil prone. I guess, Chris, one of the most, right?
Yes.
The strategists now tell how India has become the balancing pole amid rising global geopolitical tensions. Hi, I'm Shreya and you're watching The Strategist, your own global security and analysis show on national defense. So without any further ado, let's get started. The timing of Rubio leaking itinerary of acting President Delcy Rodríguez to India was critical. With the US-Israel conflict with Iran effectively shutting down the Strait of Hormuz for the past 3 months, Indian refiners have been scrambling for alternative crude sources. Additionally, the US had just penalized India with tariffs over its continued purchase of Russian oil. By publicizing Rodríguez's visit, Rubio tried forcing a public alternative onto India's plate, and that is stop buying Russian oil and Iranian oil and look into the massive influx of US-approved Venezuelan crude. We are bringing to your doorstep.
Since the post-Chavez era, the oil wealth of the country is not being stolen. The oil wealth of the country is going directly to pay government workers, buy medical equipment, audited by KPMG. That's a significant advance. That's not a permanent situation, but that's a very valuable one today. You have seen reforms. You have seen, for example, the infamous prison, El Acoide. It's been closed. You still have about 400 and something, what we determined to be believed to be political prisoners, but you've had many others that have been released, including many high-profile ones. You've seen a reform, a systemic reform in individuals involved in their government, replaced by new people.
Venezuela alone holds 17% of the entire world's proven oil reserve, a 303 billion barrel oil. Unlike the light and sweet crude found in Saudi Arabia or the US Permian Basin, which flows easily and is cheap to process, Venezuela's oil is extra heavy crude, bitumen-like petroleum. It has the thickness of molasses. It does not naturally flow through pipes well, without being blended with lighter oils or chemical solvents called dilutants. It is highly sulfur intensive. Because it requires complex high conversion refineries to process it into gasoline or diesel, Venezuelan crude historically has to be sold at a $7 to $10 billion discount per barrel compared to global benchmark like West Texas Intermediate.
In fact, in our spot purchases, Venezuela has already emerged as the third largest supplier this month. So quite naturally, today's discussions focused on forging an energy partnership.
In the late 1990s, Venezuela was a powerhouse, pumping over 3 million barrels per day. By 2020, production plummeted to decades low of roughly 350,000 barrels per day. The 2026 rebound? Following a massive geopolitical shift, including a changing political framework and heavier involvement from foreign corporations like Chevron, Repsol and India's PSUs, Venezuela has tagged a fragile recovery. Production has stabilized just past 1.1 million barrels per day.
Venezuelan energy sector is undergoing a fundamental transformation. They see India as a stable demander for many years to come, and therefore there exists a perfect complementarity for India and Venezuela to work in the energy sector, both upstream as well as downstream.
There was also a highly tactical logistic reason Rubio spoke so early. Rodriguez was originally scheduled to visit New Delhi primarily to attend the India-led International Big Cat Alliance Summit. However, due to the Ebola outbreak in Africa, India quietly postponed the summit just a day prior. Rubio spoke in Joint Base Andrews on the assumption that the trip was still fully on track. By locking the narrative in the press, the US ensured that even if the summit was delayed, the geopolitical pressure on India to discuss the Venezuelan oil transition remained front-page news. Like Trump claiming multiple times to stop India-Pakistan nuclear war, Rubio's deliberate leak was a display of Washington's superpower optics, asserting themselves as the prime movers and deal makers of global events. It is all about oil and energy. Amid continued US threats of imposing tariffs if India trades oil with Russia or Iran, Venezuela has already been third largest crude supplier of India. The Venezuelan energy sector is undergoing a fundamental transformation. So India and Venezuela realizes that it is in the interest of both nations to work in this sector. Due to new situations and unpredictably arose following the closure of Strait of Hormuz, it is pertinent to ask, can Venezuela help India defeat the Hormuz risk? As the bonhomie between coordination increasing post Marco Rubio's India visit, containing Russia and Chinese influence in Venezuela is integral part of US geopolitical strategy. China became Venezuela's largest external financer during the Chavez and Maduro years. China has provided roughly $60 to $67 billion in loans and financing packages over the past 2 decades. Venezuela became the largest recipient of Chinese lending in Latin America. At least $10 billion in Chinese loan remains outstanding. Much of the debt has been repaid through oil shipment rather than cash. China today remains a major buyer of Venezuelan crude and has continued involvement in the oil sector despite years of sanctions. China didn't primarily seek military influence in Venezuela. It sought oil security and economic influence. China has constructed and retained access to 2 satellite tracking stations in Venezuela. These are officially space-related facilities, but such installations can have strategic and intelligence value. Venezuela is the largest purchaser of Chinese military equipment in Latin America. Chinese radars, trainer aircraft, armored vehicles, communication system, and surveillance equipments are present in Venezuelan forces. In 2023, China and Venezuela upgraded relation to an all-weather strategic partnership, one of Beijing's highest diplomatic categories. For American strategists, the concern is not what Chinese infrastructure in Venezuela exists today, but what could emerge in the future. Venezuela is not just a resource-rich country. It gave Russia a geopolitical foothold in America's backyard. The backbone of the Russia-Venezuela partnership has been defense cooperation. Venezuela has purchased more than $4 billion worth of Russian military equipment. Russia became Venezuela's principal arms supplier. Venezuela forces depend heavily on Russian origin system, spare parts and maintenance support. Russia-backed energy ventures continued to operate in Venezuelan oil fields. Russia has supplied Venezuelan military equipments like Su-30 fighter aircraft, Mi-17, Mi-35 and Mi-26 helicopters, air defense system, tanks and armored vehicles, small arms and ammunition. There have also been repeated reports over the years about possible Russian access to facilities such as La Orchilla Island, but no publicly confirmed permanent Russian base exists in Venezuela, comparably to those Russian operates in places like Syria. Venezuela's relationship with the United States has changed dramatically in 2026. Washington has erased major sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector post-Maduro exit. US companies such as Chevron are expanding operations and other Western energy firms are exploring investments. The US has become Venezuela's largest oil export destination, receiving about 558,000 barrels per day in May 2026, pitching itself ahead of India. For Venezuela, India is a preferred partner. If China owns Venezuela's balance sheet and Russia protects its arsenal, India may become the partner that helps Caracas diversify both. On one hand, China wants Venezuela's oil, looking in for debt repayment and economic influence, and Russia wants strategic presence, defense ties, and political influence. India offers something different: a huge energy market, a major global South partner, no historical baggage in Venezuela, a reputation for strategic autonomy. India itself is a balancing power. India maintains independent, healthy relations with the United States, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and even China, despite border tensions. Following the US Special Forces extraction of Nicolás Maduro in January this year, the US heavily backed Delcy Rodríguez interim government and helped restructure Venezuela's oil sales apparatus. Now, Rodríguez just concluded a visit of a country that has mastered strategic balancing and strategic autonomy. India has consistently maintained that India wants to diversify its oil imports. The big question is, can Venezuela learn from India's multi-alignment strategy? Delcy Rodríguez, as she leaves the soil on 7th of June, arrived in India carrying more than a diplomatic briefcase. She arrived carrying Venezuela's biggest challenge: how do you sell oil to the world? Court new partners, attract investment, and yet avoid becoming dependent on any single great power. In today's fractured world, Venezuela is walking a diplomatic tightrope, and India may be one of the few countries that understands exactly how difficult that balancing act can be. That is all for today's episode of The Strategist. For more such global analysis, don't forget to subscribe to National Defense. I'm Shreya signing off.